Mr. Larsen, that mailbox is out of compliance. You have until the 15th.
It's the same mailbox you approved in 2009. I checked the file myself.
The board has updated its aesthetic standards.
The board updated its vendor, is what happened.
That's not relevant to this conversation.
It's the only relevant thing in this conversation.
$25 a day, starting the 16th, Mr. Larsen. That's not a threat, that's arithmetic.
Deborah Sconce had spent 2 months trying to make me buy a mailbox. She had no idea it was going to cost her the rest of her life as she knew it. My name is Keith Larsen. I'm 58 years old, and for 31 years I inspected torque specifications on transmission housings for a living, which means I have spent more of my adult life caring about whether something is correctly assembled than most people spend caring about anything. That matters here, because this whole story, every deposition, every fine, every ruined Thanksgiving, started with a piece of galvanized steel and cedar post that cost me $89 at a hardware store in Millbrook, Ohio, in the spring of 2010. My wife Carol and I bought our house in Briarwood Commons in 2003, a modest Brit colonial on a cul-de-sac called Thistlewood Court, the kind of subdivision built in the late 90s with sidewalks that led nowhere in particular, and a homeowners association that, back then, mostly concerned itself with grass height and holiday light removal deadlines. Carol sells real estate for a living, has for 22 years, and she picked that house herself out of 11 listings because the light in the kitchen hit the counter a certain way at 4 in the afternoon. I've learned not to argue with a woman who can read a house's soul in under 9 minutes. It's one of the smartest things she's ever done, and this story is, in its own roundabout way, about what almost happened to that. I spent 31 years at a transmission plant 40 minutes from our front door. Most of that time as a senior quality control inspector, which is a job that sounds boring at parties, and is, in fact, boring at parties, but teaches you something most people never have to learn. A defect you let through because fixing it was inconvenient does not stay small. It compounds. A transmission housing out of tolerance by 0.004 of an inch doesn't fail today. It fails in 18 months, on a highway, in a customer's car, and by then, it's not a 0.004 problem anymore. It's a recall, a lawsuit, and a line worker's job. I inspected 11,000 housings a year for 3 decades. I rejected on average about 400 of them. My coworkers called me Larsen the Hammer, not because I was harsh, but because once I flagged something, it stayed flagged until it was actually fixed, not until someone got tired of hearing about it. I retired in 2008 with a pension, a bad knee, and absolutely no ability to look at a clearly wrong thing and simply let it go. Carol calls this my one flaw. She is not entirely wrong, and she has occasionally suggested, with love, that I apply slightly less of it to disagreements about paint color in our own kitchen. Our original mailbox, a black and cedar colonial box on a routed post, model number stamped right into the aluminum door, Rigid Craft Colonial No. 4, had been the association-approved standard since Briarwood Commons was platted in 1998. By 2010, mine had taken a beating. Ohio winters do that. The post had gone soft at the base where the snowplow salt collects, and the door hinge had rusted enough that it dropped a ½ inch every time you opened it. I did what any homeowner in a compliant, aesthetically uniform, thoroughly bylawed subdivision is supposed to do. I bought the exact same model, brand new, off the same manufacturer's website, filed the routine post-installation notice the HOA required for any exterior modification, and installed it myself on a Saturday in April with a bag of quick-set concrete and my neighbor Marisol Ortiz holding the level. I kept the receipt. I want you to remember that I kept the receipt because in 31 years of quality control work, I have never once thrown away a piece of paper that might matter later. And that habit is the entire reason this story has an ending worth telling. 2 months after I installed that mailbox, an email went out to all 142 households in Briarwood Commons, announcing that the board had adopted a new, mandatory mailbox standard, effective immediately, and that every resident, regardless of what they currently had installed, regardless of whether it had been approved before, was required to replace it within 90 days with the new association-designated unit. Cost to the homeowner? $499, installation included, payable directly to a company called Sconce Precision Mailboxes, LLC. No vote, no ballot, no board meeting where residents could weigh in, just an email, a deadline, and an invoice. Here's the detail I want you to file away, because it comes back later, and it comes back hard. The new mandatory mailbox, once I finally got my hands on the spec sheet, was nearly identical to the one I'd just installed. Same cedar tone, same colonial silhouette. The only meaningful difference was a slightly wider mail slot and a powder-coated finish instead of raw aluminum. A cosmetic difference you'd need a caliper to notice. I know, because I own calipers. My neighbors were furious in the specific, temporary way people get furious about $499. A lot of grumbling on the Thistlewood Court group text. A lot of, "This is ridiculous." And then, within 6 weeks, 40 of the 61 occupied lots had quietly paid up. I understand why. Most people have better things to do with their Saturdays than fight a homeowners association over a mailbox. I might have been one of them if I hadn't spent 3 decades of my career watching companies try to slide a defective part past an inspector by hoping nobody checked the tolerance. I check the tolerance. It's not a virtue. It's closer to a disorder, honestly, and Carol will tell you that with a fondness that has occasionally worn thin. I want to be honest about that from the start, because this was never a story about a man who couldn't afford $500. This was a story about a man who'd spent his career believing that if you let a small defect through because fixing it was inconvenient, you were setting yourself up for a much larger failure down the line. I told Carol that first week, sitting at our kitchen table where the 4 o'clock light was doing exactly what she'd promised it would. If we pay this, they'll do it again. Next year it'll be shutters. The year after that, it'll be a specific brand of storm door. There has to be a line somewhere, and it might as well be a mailbox, because at least a mailbox is cheap enough that nobody thinks you're crazy for holding it. Nobody thought that yet, anyway. Deborah Sconce had been president of the Briarwood Commons Homeowners Association for 6 years by the time this started. And if you want to understand the entire shape of what was coming, you need to understand Deborah first. She was 54, carried a monogrammed binder everywhere, navy blue, gold embossed initials, tabbed sections labeled things like curb appeal compliance and streetscape cohesion initiatives. And she used the phrase aesthetic uniformity the way other people use punctuation. She drove a white Lexus with a Briarwood Commons board member parking placard she'd had custom printed, despite the fact that Briarwood Commons had exactly 1 parking lot at the clubhouse, and it fit 9 cars. She had fined a family on Larsen Lane $200 for a garden flag depicting a cardinal on the grounds that it did not match the association's approved seasonal palette. She had sent a resident on Winding Creek Drive a violation notice for a non-compliant shade of beige on a storm door that, when independently color-matched at a hardware store, turned out to be the exact beige the association's own paint guide specified. She apologized for that one. It's the only time I ever heard of her apologizing for anything, and even then, it read more like a hostage note than an admission. She governed 142 households the way a substitute teacher governs a classroom of children, who've already figured out she has no actual authority to keep them after the bell, with volume, with paperwork, and with the unshakable confidence of someone who has never once been asked to produce a source for her own rules. Her laminated seasonal palette guide, 7 pages long, had apparently been drafted entirely by Deborah herself over 1 long weekend, with no board vote, no homeowner input, and no discernible relationship to the actual recorded architectural guidelines sitting in the county recorder's office a 1.5 miles away. Gathering dust she had clearly never once bothered to check. Her dialogue, when she wasn't improvising, had the cadence of someone reciting from a laminated card. The board has adopted updated aesthetic standards in the interest of protecting community property values. Compliance is not optional, it is a condition of residency. I understand your frustration, but the association's decision is final. I used to imagine her rehearsing these lines in her Lexus before board meetings, the way I used to rehearse defect reports before a difficult client call, except my scripts were built on measurements, and hers were built on nothing at all, which I wouldn't fully appreciate until much later. By the time this was over, Deborah Sconce had filed 9 separate violation notices against my property alone. 9 notices, 9 identical templates with a different date stamped in the corner. 9 times the word compliance appeared in bold. I know the exact number because I filed every one of them, in order, in a binder considerably less expensive than hers, but, as it turned out, considerably more useful in a courtroom. The first violation notice arrived on association letterhead 16 days after I told the board, in writing, that I would not be purchasing the new mailbox. It cited my mailbox as non-compliant with Section 7.3 of the amended Community Aesthetic Standards, and warned that continued non-compliance would result in escalating remedial fees. I want to be precise about something here because it matters for what comes later. Section 7.3, as originally recorded with Wexford County in 1998, said nothing whatsoever about mailboxes. It governed exterior paint colors. Deborah's board had simply amended it by board vote, without the 2/3 homeowner supermajority Ohio law requires for that category of change. I didn't know that yet. I would know it, eventually, down to the page number. I photographed the notice. I photographed my mailbox, front and side, with my phone's date stamp visible in the corner, and I saved it into a folder on my desktop I labeled, with the kind of dry inevitability I didn't fully appreciate until later. Mailbox. That folder would eventually hold 411 files. The fine started on the 16th of the following month, exactly as promised. $25 a day, arithmetic, and not a threat, in Deborah's words. I let them accrue. This is the part people always ask me about. Why would you let a fine pile up instead of just paying it or fighting it immediately? And the honest answer is that in quality control, you don't file a defect report on your first data point. You let the pattern establish itself, because a pattern is what convinces a judge, and a single data point is just an anecdote. $25 a day for 90 days is $2,250. I paid none of it, and I logged every single invoice. The second escalation came in July, when an HOA maintenance crew, 2 men in a Sconce Precision Mailboxes van, which I noted with the mild professional interest of a man who used to audit supplier relationships for a living, installed a brand new association-approved mailbox directly beside my existing one, close enough that the 2 boxes nearly touched. No permission asked. No notice given beyond a form letter slipped under my door that morning, citing provisional remedial installation pending homeowner compliance. For 3 weeks, my house had 2 mailboxes standing shoulder to shoulder at the end of the driveway like a visual indictment, the new one gleaming under its fresh powder coat, mine looking exactly as serviceable and exactly as unauthorized as it had the day before. The 2 of them close enough that our actual mail carrier, a woman named Sherry who'd worked our route for a decade, started leaving notes taped to whichever box she'd used that day, just so nobody accused her of picking sides in a dispute that clearly wasn't hers. Marisol, from 3 doors down, told me later that Deborah had walked half the cul-de-sac showing people photos of it on her phone, captioned apparently, "This is what non-compliance looks like." I kept a photo of my own. Mine was captioned, in the file, simply, Exhibit C. The third rung came in September, in the HOA's quarterly newsletter, the Briarwood Beacon. 4 glossy pages that usually covered pool hours and landscaping contracts. That issue carried a full paragraph, unsigned but unmistakably Deborah's cadence, about a small number of residents whose refusal to comply with community standards continues to depress property values for everyone. It didn't name me. It didn't need to. 61 households on my street and 1 mailbox 2 doors down that looked like a crime scene. Carol started getting phone calls from clients who'd heard, secondhand, that the Larsens were the family suing everybody, which wasn't even true yet, but proximity to conflict apparently reads the same as guilt to a certain kind of buyer. And Carol lost 2 listings that fall to agents who worked cleaner neighborhoods. The 4th rung is the one that still makes me angriest, 4 years on. In October, Deborah filed a formal complaint with the County Code Enforcement Office, alleging that my aggressive dog had charged a landscaping crew working on a neighboring property. I have never owned a dog. Carol is allergic to nearly everything with fur, badly enough that she once had to leave a listing appointment early because the sellers had a cat somewhere in the walls. The code enforcement officer, a patient man named Russ Whitaker, who would become an unlikely bright spot in this whole ordeal, drove out, looked at my dogless backyard, checked with the actual landscaping crew, who confirmed no such incident had occurred, on my property or otherwise, and wrote, "Unfounded, no animal present," on his report, in handwriting considerably neater than the complaint that had sent him out there in the first place. On his way back to his truck, he told me this was the 2nd anonymous complaint about my address that year. He couldn't tell me who filed the first one. He didn't need to. I was starting to understand that Deborah wasn't just trying to find me into compliance anymore. She was trying to build a file that made me look unstable, the kind of file you show a judge later to explain why a reasonable board had no choice but to take firmer action against a difficult resident. The 5th rung arrived the following spring on the Briarwood Commons private social media group, a page technically run by the association, but administered in practice entirely by Deborah. A post went up describing an unnamed resident whose erratic behavior and refusal to engage in good faith had allegedly frightened a dog-walking neighbor at dusk. A different, second phantom dog incident, this one apparently involving my own supposed erratic behavior rather than a non-existent pet. 41 comments in 6 hours, most of them from people who had never spoken to me directly in 19 years of living 4 doors down. Marisol screenshotted every one, time-stamped, before Deborah quietly deleted the post 2 days later, once a lawyer's letter from Owen arrived asking, politely, whether the association's insurance carrier was aware it was hosting unsubstantiated character allegations against a specific identifiable homeowner. The post came down within the hour. Funny how fast these things move once someone mentions the word insurance. By November, the 6th rung, the HOA filed a lien against our house for $11,400 in accumulated fines. The original violation, the daily assessments, and something called a compliance administration surcharge that Deborah's board had apparently invented sometime around rung 3. A lien is not a small thing. It clouds your title. It shows up when you try to refinance, when you try to sell, when a mortgage company runs a search on your address. Carol, who sells houses for a living and understands exactly what a lien does to a closing, sat across from me at that same kitchen table, 4 o'clock light gone gray with the season, and said the only thing she ever said to me in anger through this entire 7-year fight. "Keith, I need you to be right about this, because if you're not, we're going to lose more than $500. I told her I was right. I didn't fully know yet how right, but I was going to find out. By the time this whole fight reached its 7th and final rung, a formal notice threatening foreclosure on the lien if it went unpaid another 90 days, Deborah had racked up a tally I'd eventually read aloud in a courtroom. 9 violation notices, 2 false incident reports, 1 clubhouse social media post, 1 lien, and 0 homeowner votes authorizing any single part of it. 9 notices, 2 false reports, 1 lien, 0 votes. I made Owen write that exact sentence into our filing, precisely as I've just said it to you, because a judge, like a plant manager, responds better to a clean tally than a paragraph of complaints. Here's something most people don't realize. In Ohio, homeowners associations operating under a recorded declaration are governed by Chapter 5312 of the Ohio Revised Code, and any amendment to a community's use restrictions that materially changes an owner's obligations, like converting an aesthetic guideline into a mandatory purchase requirement, generally requires the supermajority vote specified in the association's own governing documents, not a simple board resolution. Briarwood Commons' declaration, recorded in 1998, required 2/3 of homeowners to approve any amendment altering owner financial obligations. Deborah's board had passed the new mailbox standard with a 5-0 board vote and no homeowner ballot whatsoever. That's not a technicality. That's the entire foundation of her authority to do any of this, and it didn't exist. I hired Owen Vance that winter, a paralegal I'd known since our sons played travel baseball together a decade earlier. Sharp as anything, despite never having finished law school himself. The kind of researcher who reads a statute the way I used to read a torque spec, for the number, not the narrative. We met at a diner off Route 9 every other Thursday for 2 years, and Owen always ordered the same thing: black coffee and dry wheat toast, like a man who'd decided food was a distraction from the real work. Owen pulled the recorded declaration from the Wexford County Recorder's office and found the supermajority clause within an afternoon. Keith, he told me over coffee, they didn't just skip a step. They skipped the entire staircase. Marisol Ortiz, my neighbor with the steady hands from the mailbox installation Saturday, worked as a bookkeeper for a landscaping company and had an accountant's eye for inconsistency most people reserve for their own tax returns. She started her own file not because I asked her to, but because she'd noticed something on her own street that bothered her the way an unbalanced ledger bothers a bookkeeper, a pattern in who got fined and who never did. Keith, she told me one evening over her fence, holding a legal pad with rows of addresses and dates in handwriting neater than my own engineering drawings ever were. I've been doing this for 4 months. Nobody on the board's own street has ever gotten a single notice, not one. I asked her why she was keeping track at all, since none of it was her fight. She said, simply, that she didn't like watching someone get fined for something her own neighbors were doing too, and getting away with it because of who they knew. That's the whole difference between Marisol and Deborah, if you want it in one sentence. One of them thought proximity to power was a shield. The other thought it was exactly the thing worth writing down. That would have been enough on its own. It wasn't the only thing we found. The turning point, the actual power shift moment, the one where the entire fight flipped from defense to offense, came from Doreen Okafor, a clerk at the Wexford County Recorder's office who Owen had befriended over the course of several records requests. Doreen wasn't doing anything improper. She simply mentioned, in the way people mention things they assume everyone already knows, that Sconce Precision Mailboxes LLC's registered agent on file with the Ohio Secretary of State was a man named Roy Sconce, Deborah's husband. I sat with that for a long moment before I understood the full shape of it. Deborah Sconce, HOA president, had used a board vote with no homeowner approval in violation of her own association's supermajority requirement to mandate that 142 households purchase a product from a company owned by her own husband at $499 per household. 61 lots on my street alone. If even half of Briarwood Commons complied, that was upwards of $35,000 flowing directly into her husband's LLC, generated by an aesthetic standard that, on paper, differed from my existing mailbox by the width of a mail slot. Here's something else most people don't realize. Ohio's Planned Community Statute requires board members to disclose, in the association's own meeting minutes, any financial interest they or an immediate family member hold in a contract or vendor arrangement being considered by the board. A disclosure Deborah had never made, in 6 years, across at least 4 separate board votes touching the mailbox program. An undisclosed conflict like that isn't just an ethical lapse. It's a distinct breach of fiduciary duty under the same chapter governing the board's authority to fine anyone in the first place, which meant the very statute Deborah had been waving at me for 6 years was the same statute that was about to be waved back. We had 3 separate, independently damning threads now, each one a small gotcha on its own. The supermajority vote that never happened, Roy Sconce's ownership of the vendor, and Marisol's pattern showing selective enforcement against everyone except the board's own street. Individually, any one of these might have been an uncomfortable board meeting. Together, they were a lawsuit with teeth. I want to be honest about the toll this took before I tell you how it ended, because the money was never the hard part. The hard part was watching Carol's business quietly bleed for years over a fight her husband had chosen and she hadn't. The hard part was 2 Thanksgivings where extended family asked, with the particular concern reserved for people they suspect have lost perspective, whether it was really worth it over a mailbox. The hard part was a for sale sign on Larsen Lane that stayed up 4 months longer than it should have because a buyer's agent mentioned, off the record, that the neighborhood had some ongoing HOA drama. I never once regretted holding the line. I regretted, plenty of times, what holding it cost the person who hadn't asked to hold it with me. Carol found out about Roy Sconce before I finished explaining it. I remember exactly where we were standing. The kitchen, that same 4 o'clock light, a stack of closing documents from a sale she'd nearly lost spread across the counter. When I said the words registered agent and Roy Sconce in the same sentence, she set down the folder she was holding very slowly, the way you set down something you're afraid you might otherwise throw, and said, "Say that again?" I said it again. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I've thought about more than almost anything else from those 7 years. "Keith, I have spent 4 years apologizing to clients for a fight I thought was about your stubbornness. It was never about your stubbornness. It was about her husband's mailbox company." She didn't apologize for doubting me, because she'd never really doubted the facts, only the cost. What she did instead was drive to the county recorder's office with Owen the following Tuesday and pull every filing herself. And from that point forward, Carol Larsen stopped being the spouse enduring my fight and became one of the people running it. She has a better read on a hostile room than any attorney I ever paid by the hour, and she proved it, repeatedly, over the next 3 years. We filed suit in the Wexford County Court of Common Pleas in March of 2011, seeking a declaratory judgment that the mailbox amendment was void for failing the supermajority requirement, removal of the lien, and damages for the improper fines. Deborah's board hired a firm out of Columbus for the first 18 months. Sharp letterhead, aggressive filings, the kind of firm that bills like it's personal. 3 attorneys copied on every letter as if volume of signature blocks could substitute for the strength of an argument. By year 3, after the first summary judgment motion failed, it was down to 1 attorney from that firm and a lot fewer adjectives in the filings. By year 4, after a second motion failed and the board's legal reserve fund had visibly thinned, Marisol's bookkeeper's eye caught the HOA's published budget quietly reclassifying legal reserve as legal reserve depleted under review, 2 years running. They'd switched to a solo practitioner working out of a strip mall office above a dry cleaner, filing typo-riddled motions that read like they'd been drafted between other clients, occasionally citing case law from the wrong state entirely. By year 6, the invoices Deborah was still trying to bill back to the HOA membership had shrunk from a Columbus firm's $400 hourly rate to a flat $200 fee per appearance, which is the legal equivalent of a restaurant switching from a printed menu to a laminated one. You could track the board's confidence the way you'd track a failing part on a production line. Smaller vendors, cheaper materials, corners cut in ways that tell you the whole assembly is coming apart before anyone says so out loud. Tom Riley, a reporter at the Wexford County Sentinel who'd covered 2 prior HOA disputes in the county, started following the case in year 3 after Owen sent him the recorded declaration and the vendor filing side by side with a 2-line email. I met Tom once at a coffee shop in downtown Millbrook, a notebook and a folder between us on a small round table. He read through everything without saying a word for almost 15 minutes, which for a reporter is roughly the professional equivalent of a standing ovation. Then he looked up and said, "Mr. Larsen, I've covered HOA disputes for 6 years. I have never once seen the board president's own husband own the vendor." I told him I understood the story was newsworthy. He said, "Newsworthy undersells it. This is the kind of story people forward to their whole family group chat." He wasn't wrong. Tom's first story ran under the headline, "Mailbox Fight Reveals Deeper Questions About HOA Vendor Ties," and it was accurate, careful, and devastating in the specific way that accurate, careful reporting always is to people who were counting on nobody checking. Here's something else most people don't realize, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Under Ohio's Valentine Act, the state's own antitrust statute, an arrangement that conditions a benefit, in this case, good standing as a homeowner, free of fines and liens, on the purchase of a specific vendor's product, where that vendor is controlled by the very official imposing the condition, can be treated as an illegal tying arrangement, entirely separate from whatever the association's own bylaws say. Owen found this in our second year, tucked into a case summary from an unrelated commercial dispute, and called me at 9 at night to read me the relevant paragraph twice. It wasn't the thread that ultimately won us the case. It was the thread that made Deborah's attorney stop returning Owen's calls for 11 days, which told us more about how strong our position was than any single ruling could have. By our 7th year, 31 of the 61 households on Thistlewood Court had signed a petition, gathered quietly by Marisol over 4 months, invoking the 20% of membership threshold in Ohio's Planned Community Statute to force a special homeowner meeting on the Mailbox Amendment and the board's vendor relationship, regardless of what the courts eventually decided. Deborah couldn't refuse it. It was written into the same bylaws her board had been citing at me for 6 years. Marisol did this the way she did everything. Quietly and on foot, one porch at a time, on evenings after her own workday ended. She didn't lead with the lawsuit or the sconce's name. She led with her own enforcement log, laid flat on a clipboard, and asked each neighbor a single question. Does it seem fair to you that nobody on the board's own street has ever gotten a violation notice in 6 years for the exact same thing Keith Larsen got fined $11,000 over? Most people signed before she finished the sentence. A few needed a second visit. One elderly resident on Winding Creek Drive, the same beige storm door family Deborah had once wrongly cited, signed so fast she nearly tore the paper, and told Marisol, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question, instead of telling me the answer." The meeting was held in the Briarwood Commons Clubhouse on a Tuesday evening in early 2017. Folding chairs arranged in rows, facing a card table where the board usually sat. And for the first time in the history of that clubhouse, every chair was full. Deborah opened with 12 minutes on landscaping renewals before a resident from Larkin Lane stood up and asked, flatly, if they could please discuss the actual reason 31 households had signed a petition. Deborah's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. I walked to the front with Owen beside me, a folder under his arm thick enough to double as a doorstop, and Marisol 2 rows back with her own binder of enforcement records. I didn't raise my voice. 31 years of quality control teaches you that shouting is what people do when they don't have the data, and I had the data. I put 5 pages on the overhead projector, one at a time, the same way I used to present a defect report to a plant manager who didn't want to hear it. The first was the 1998 Recorded Declaration, Article 9, the supermajority clause highlighted in yellow. The second was the board's own 2010 meeting minutes showing a 5-0 vote and no homeowner ballot of any kind. The third was the Ohio Secretary of State's business filing for Sconce Precision Mailboxes LLC, registered agent Roy Sconce, $499 per household, 61 lots on my street alone. The fourth was Marisol's enforcement log, showing that in 6 years, not one of the 11 properties on the board member's own street had ever received a mailbox violation, despite 4 of them still running the same, non-compliant model mine was fined for. The fifth slide was simply a number, the running total of assessed fines and fees across all 142 households under an amendment that had never been properly adopted. $86,400. The room went the kind of quiet where you can hear the clubhouse's ancient air conditioning cycle on. Somebody near the back said, loud enough to carry, "Roy Sconce owns the mailbox company?" Every head in that room turned toward the third row, where Roy sat in a golf polo, holding a paper coffee cup he had clearly stopped drinking from. He didn't stand. He didn't deny it. He looked at the screen, then at his wife, then at the floor, and said exactly nothing, which in a room of 80 people who had just watched his name appear on a state business filing projected 6 feet wide, was its own kind of confession. Deborah reached for her gavel, an actual gavel, engraved, that I'm fairly certain she'd ordered specifically for meetings like this one, and found that a room can simply decide not to let you use it anymore. Nobody was rude. Nobody needed to be. The silence did all the necessary work. The board attorney, the same solo practitioner from the strip mall office, stood up and asked for a recess to consult with the board, which is the sound a legal position makes right before it collapses entirely. The case had taken 7 years to reach that clubhouse meeting, in no small part because Deborah's board fought every motion and appealed every ruling they could along the way, including one memorable filing which Owen read aloud to me twice because he couldn't quite believe a licensed attorney had submitted it with a straight face, arguing that mailbox specifications were a matter of board discretion not subject to judicial review. The clubhouse meeting didn't end the lawsuit by itself, but it ended the board's ability to pretend, even to its own membership, that there was still a defense left worth mounting. 3 months later, in 2017, Judge Colleen Marsh of the Wexford County Court of Common Pleas ruled in a 16-page decision that the mailbox amendment was void ab initio for failing to meet the declaration's supermajority requirement, that the accumulated fines and lien were unenforceable and must be released, and that the board's arrangement with Sconce Precision Mailboxes LLC, given Roy Sconce's undisclosed ownership interest, constituted a breach of the board's fiduciary duty to the association's membership. She ordered the lien struck from our title within 10 days, and the association to refund, with interest, every homeowner who had paid the $499 fee under an amendment the court had just declared void from the start. 41 households, just over $20,500 returned. I spent $33,000 in legal fees over those 7 years to keep an $89 mailbox. I've done that math more times than I care to admit, and I've never once come out the other side regretting it, because the number that actually mattered wasn't the mailbox. It was the supermajority clause protecting 142 households from a board that had already shown exactly what it would do with unchecked authority once, and would have done again. The board held an emergency election 8 weeks after the ruling. Deborah did not run for re-election. I'm told she didn't wait to be asked not to. Judge Marsh's order also required the board to personally reimburse, from board members' own pockets rather than the association's operating account, $1,800 in legal costs tied specifically to the dismissed board discretion motion, on the grounds that it had been filed in bad faith. A small number next to the $33,000 I'd spent, but a genuinely painful one for a woman who had spent 6 years insisting the association's money was hers to direct. The monogrammed binder, I've heard secondhand, was retired along with her. Roy Sconce's LLC quietly dissolved its state registration the following spring, not long after the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division sent a letter of inquiry regarding the vendor arrangement. Nothing ever came of that inquiry beyond the letter itself, but I'm told Roy stopped mentioning the mailbox business at his golf league within about a week of receiving it. A retired school teacher named Priya Anand took over as HOA president and, in her first act, restored the original 1998 architectural guidelines, mailbox and all, with an actual homeowner vote this time, 94-6. Her second act was refunding, in full, the $1,800 in fines Marisol Ortiz herself had quietly paid 3 years earlier rather than fight the board alone. A fact Marisol had never once mentioned to me until the check arrived at her own door. 2 weeks after the ruling was final, before the refund checks had even gone out, someone destroyed my mailbox. Not vandalized, destroyed. The post snapped clean at the base. The box itself found 40 feet down the ditch line the next morning. Russ Whitaker, the same code enforcement officer who'd cleared my non-existent dog 4 years earlier, came out at my request, more out of professional curiosity than jurisdiction. No footage, no witnesses, no leads that ever went anywhere. Whoever did it was never caught, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Some things you win in court and lose anyway, in some small symbolic way, and you learn to let the symbolism go once the substance is already secure. Carol's idea, not mine, was what closed this out properly. That October, we hosted the first annual Thistlewood Court Mailbox Day, open to every kid on the street. A folding table of paint and brushes and a stack of the exact same rigid craft Colonial No. 4 mailboxes, purchased at cost from a supplier Owen tracked down 2 states over. No HOA involvement of any kind required. 19 kids painted 19 mailboxes that first year. Dinosaurs, a very ambitious solar system, one that was just an enormous cartoon dog, which Carol found a little too on the nose given everything. The very first mailbox off that folding table went to a 9-year-old named Ellis Marchetti from Larsen Lane, whose family had been one of the 41 households refunded under Judge Marsh's order. His mother told Carol, quietly by the paint table, that the refund check had covered exactly what they still owed on their own mailbox invoice from 3 years earlier, dollar for dollar, and that Ellis had asked if he could paint his brand new one the same navy blue as a police badge, because he wanted to be the kind of person who checks if things are actually true. Carol had to step away from the table for a minute after that one. We've done Thistlewood Court Mailbox Day every October since, and it isn't really about mailboxes anymore, and it never really was. If your HOA has ever tried to force you into buying something you didn't need from someone you didn't choose, I want to hear about it in the comments. I'd bet my $89 mailbox that I'm not the only one. I still have that mailbox, by the way, the original one. The one that started all of this. It sits in my garage now, dented post and all, because Carol wouldn't let me throw it away once the case was finally over, and because some things earn a place in a garage simply by outlasting everyone who once told you they didn't belong there. And next week, an HOA tries to condemn a decorated veteran's detached garage as an unpermitted structure and discovers 30 seconds into the inspection that it's a fully licensed firearms training facility. You will not want to miss that one. Subscribe, and I'll see you then.